Bonjour, everyone. Je m'appelle Aiden Durham with 180 Law Co. in Denver, Colorado, and you're watching All Up in Your Business. In this episode of All Up in Your Business, I'm going to give you guys a little French lesson. Just kidding, I don't actually know any French, but in this episode of All Up in Your Business, we're going to talk about force majeure. Currently, as we film this, we're still in the middle of the COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic. If you're watching this in the future, hopefully we're out of it and the world is back to normal now. But currently, because of this, a lot of businesses and people are experiencing struggles and difficulties in just managing their business and operating on a day-to-day basis. And because of these extraordinary circumstances due to, stay-at-home orders and quarantines and business closures, a lot of people are asking if they can excuse or delay their performance or obligations under a contract due to the occurrence of a force majeure event. Or in other words, people are wondering, can they get out of their contractual obligations due to this coronavirus pandemic? Before we get into it, make sure to like, subscribe, and share, s'il vous plaît, and check the description for links to some additional information and resources too. So what is force majeure? As you may have caught on, it's a French term. The actual French transliteration means superior force. But aside from being just a fun word to say, force majeure is also a very important legal term and legal doctrine. Essentially, when we apply it to law and to contract law, it's something like an uncontrollable or irresistible force or an event or some kind of effect that the parties couldn't have some reasonable control over. A lot of times it's referred to as like an act of God. A force majeure event essentially is something that the parties in their reasonable control can't predict or determine or control the outcome of. Force majeure is a contract clause that essentially provides a defense that allows a party to the contract to suspend or cancel their performance under that contract under certain circumstances. And then in some situations, it may limit a party's liability in certain circumstances too. Just like everything in law, force majeure is very dependent on the circumstances. And so how a force majeure clause will apply is going to depend on exactly how it's written and the circumstances of that situation and the facts themselves. Let's go on a little flashback to Aiden's first year law school contracts 101 class. Doodle-doo, doodle-doo, doodle-doo. In that class, we learned a lot of case history of contracts, including force majeure. And there was an important case from 1991 where the court stated when a party cannot perform its obligations under a contract because of an act of God or other unforeseen circumstances, the act of God does not relieve that party of their contractual obligations unless the parties expressly provided otherwise. So essentially, this court determined that unless the contract has some force majeure clause, a party won't be excused from performing their obligations or their duties under a contract just because of acts of God or forces or circumstances beyond your control. So if you're in a situation where you can't perform your contract because of the coronavirus pandemic, the fact that you're literally unable to isn't really going to give you an out from that contract unless there's a good force majeure clause in it. However, in a contract where there is a force majeure clause, such acts of God or other circumstances beyond your control may be excused. So now, taking it in the context of COVID-19 and this current pandemic, whether our current situation will excuse you or excuse a party from performance or obligations under a contract is going to be completely dependent on the specific language in that force majeure clause. So let's take an easy example. If you're in a contract and the contract has a force majeure clause in it, and that clause says in the events of, acts of God, riots, pandemics, disease, blah, 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 goes on and so forth, then most likely it's pretty clear that that force majeure clause meant to apply to pandemics such as COVID-19, and that would excuse performance or delay performance for one of the parties under the contract. But it's not terribly common to see epidemic or pandemic or disease in a force majeure clause. It'll typically include some other kind of catch-all phrases like acts of God, wars, strikes, disasters, national emergencies, government regulations, and then there'll often be another catch-all that's like any other circumstances beyond the party's control or beyond the party's reasonable control. So that's typically what we see is these kind of generic catch-all answers for what a force majeure event is. So the question then becomes, if your contract doesn't have a force majeure clause that includes pandemic or disease or something like that, is the COVID-19 pandemic included in these other catch-alls of being outside of the party's control? With all of the lockdowns and closures and shutdowns and stay-at-home orders, many businesses simply cannot perform their contractual obligations. And so many are asserting force majeure as a way to eliminate or limit their liability due to their inability to perform. So typically a force majeure event will be something that is outside of the party's control or reasonable control. It's not foreseeable to the parties, and therefore it can't be prevented or predicted. Of course, the event has to materially affect the party's ability to perform the obligations. If the coronavirus pandemic is happening, but it's not actually affecting your ability to perform your obligations, then you can't use force majeure as a defense. But if it is materially affecting your performance, then that goes into what is considered a force majeure event. And then finally, the parties have to have taken any reasonable steps to mitigate damages or to, minimize ultimately the damage and delay that will be resulted. One important thing here to remember is that force majeure only applies if the obligations become impossible to perform. If you literally cannot perform your obligations due to these circumstances. It doesn't just mean if it's burdensome or annoying or, inconvenient. If COVID-19 pandemic is making it more difficult for you to do your job, that's not the same as it making it impossible for you to do your job. So if you're wanting to show that the COVID-19 pandemic has had some material effect on your business or on your ability to perform your obligations, you're going to have to be able to establish some kind of actual causal link between the pandemic and your inability to perform. And then there's also the question of, was this situation foreseeable? To a lot of us, that may seem like an easy answer. No, of course not. How could we foresee a huge pandemic like this coming about? But, I am guessing this is going to be a pretty highly debatable question. Some people, news commentators, health professionals consider pandemics or epidemics like this to be unpredictable, but inevitable, which would typically make it a force majeure event. But then a lot of others say that in light of recent other pandemics like with SARS and H1N1 and all of those other pandemics that were around, we could reasonably foresee a situation like this occurring. So there are two schools of thought on it of how can we possibly predict when a pandemic will arise versus we're seeing it pop up pretty often. We should now expect this could be a situation to arise. So specifically with regard to coronavirus, if it was a contract that was executed before the coronavirus pandemic started happening, or before it became so widespread and so widely affecting, which I think most people are considering that to be January of 2020. So if you were in a contract prior to around January of 2020 and it's now being affected because of the pandemic, then it's likely that force majeure would apply because we didn't foresee this coming. However, if you entered into a contract after January 2020 with a force majeure clause, you would be expected to know, okay, we are currently in a pandemic. It's foreseeable to expect that this will continue. So we need to address that. So in that kind of a situation, force majeure is probably not going to do you any good, because courts will expect that you should have known that this was going to be an issue under this contract. Ultimately, whether COVID-19 and this whole pandemic and the shutdowns and everything, if this is ultimately going to be considered an act of God, or if it was foreseeable or not, that question remains open. We really don't know, and we're not gonna know until this starts going through the court process and people start litigating the issue, and then courts make a decision about whether this was an act of God or foreseeable or whatever else. So, there is no answer to whether coronavirus counts as a force majeure event. We'll just have to wait and see. Aside from force majeure, there are some situations where you can be excused or released from liability if you can't perform an obligation under a contract. In some situations, performance can be excused if an event has made it impracticable. You heard me right. I did not say impractical. I said impracticable. And there are other legal doctrines of impracticability or impossibility of a contract. So force majeure isn't the only option for getting out of or excusing performance under a contract due to circumstances beyond your control, but it's the one that's most commonly popping up right now due to our current situation. And then finally, a little detail specifically with force majeure and really just contracts in general. If a force majeure event does come up, or if some event comes up where you're unable to perform or unable to perform on time, you still have a duty to mitigate your damages, or a duty to reduce or minimize the ultimate damage as much as possible. So if you can get a little bit of work done, you need to do as much as you can get done before it becomes impossible or impracticable or unreasonable to do so. And you have to take whatever other steps might be reasonably accessible to you to try to perform or to otherwise minimize ultimately the damage and the delay under the contract. So if you are in a situation currently where you are experiencing the inability to perform or impossibility to perform due to the coronavirus pandemic, or if you're a party to a contract, let's say maybe a lease that you're trying to get out of, or if this is affecting you in some way, the first thing to do is talk to an attorney in your state for help on what your options are. If you have a contract with a force majeure clause, that will need to be reviewed to see how it might apply in these situations. So anyway, if coronavirus is affecting your ability to perform your job, or if it's affecting how someone else is performing for you, then it's a good idea to talk to an attorney about your options and rights. That's all for this episode, folks. Drop a comment below and let me know what you think. Let me know what your favorite French term is. Thank you all so much for watching. I'm Aiden Durham, and I'll see you next time. Au revoir.